As of today, Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich has been in a prison for 1 year in Russia, held in pre-trial detention on espionage charges the U.S. government says are made up. In place of an A1 story today, a part of the Wall Street Journal's front page is completely blank, as you can see. Assigned to readers at Gershkovich's byline is still missing. Joining us now, NBC Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Joel Rubin. It's quite a bold move for the Wall Street Journal to blank out a good section, of its A1.
Yeah.
What are they saying to readers about Evan?
Well, they tell some, frankly, heartrending stories about his contact with his family, that he's even been able to, at times, send flowers to loved ones, that they can exchange letters. We've seen him in court, despite the fact that, for example, our team in Moscow this time were not allowed in court to see him when he, for that hearing this week. We've seen him in court, and he does appear, and you can't tell necessarily from appearances, but he does appear to be physically strong and, you hope, mentally strong. Listen, he's being kept at the Fortovo prison in central Moscow. It is a chilling place. It's a history with the KGB there. And really that illustrates, I mean, you know, he's accused of espionage, categorically denied, of course, by his loved ones and by the Wall Street Journal and by the American government. He's at the center of President Putin's obsession with spying and with spies, because, of course, he is himself a former KGB officer, and the person that we pretty clearly believe the Russians want to swap for Evan and others is himself a FSB officer being held in Germany.
What's the deal, from your knowledge, Joel, about that potential swap or that desired swap?
Well, you know, Katie, the unjust detention of Evan is on its face an attempt to shut down any information coming out of Russia, first and foremost. That's why Vladimir Putin imprisoned him. He was doing real reporting of real people in real Russia and their concerns about the war in Ukraine in particular he was starting to focus on. But the swap dimensions got complicated when Alexei Navalny was murdered, frankly, by Vladimir Putin. And that was one of the potential deals that are being constructed, and this means a trilateral type of agreement. The U.S. working with Germany to release this FSB assassin and to have him be traded. And so it's a very complicated dynamic now that Navalny is no longer part of that potential mix.
Brittany Griner was traded for a notorious arms dealer that had been in American prisons for quite some time, was almost on the verge of getting out. But did that incentivize? I mean, we talk about not wanting to incentivize foreign governments to kidnap Americans. Did that incentivize Vladimir Putin to take another American?
You know, I think there's a part of a story to that. But the other part is that, quite frankly, the pressure right now is being reduced on Russia. The lack of support in the United States for additional funding for Ukraine right now is creating what we're now seeing, a much more emboldened Vladimir Putin declaring victory in a faux election, really shutting down a lot of internal dissent after that election. So there are a lot of dynamics at play as well. That trade that had to be made, that was important to get Brittany Griner out. Moving it forward is always important. But I think there's a lot of big picture items as well that are harming this negotiation.
I think also, though, it's worth saying, and from my trips to Russia, I can tell you that the revisionist history that President Putin talks about, the way that he reframes history to suit his political objectives, that is believed by a lot of Russians. They really do buy into that. And I think, you know, President Putin has a lot of support in Russia, and that partly is to do with the state-controlled media, the kind of messages that they have been sending to the Russian people for a very long time. But the wider challenge here, because your question is about whether or not the US, by doing trades, actually makes it more likely there's going to be more trade. I think there is a wider question here about a huge long-term threat, no matter what happens on the front lines of the war in Ukraine. And that long-term threat is to do with the way the Russian people are culturally thinking now, to do with the fact that the Russian economy is becoming a military economy. And when President Zelensky and others in Europe talk about the danger that this can escalate into a wider war, it may not happen next year. It may not happen in years to come. But President Putin right now is looking at potentially 12 more years in power. And even if he did go, who would replace him in that kind of atmosphere now in Russia?
Right?
That is what we need to be concerned with. And the question of whether the US sends money to Ukraine is a question of whether the West is prepared to take the risk of what will happen if the Ukrainian front line collapses. It might not happen, but are we prepared to take that risk?
That is putting it in really relevant terms. Let me ask you again about, just one more time, about Evan himself. I am struck, as you mentioned, that he does look well when we see him in court. Do we know what he might be experiencing in this pretrial detention? Also, why is it still pretrial detention?
Well,
why does the trial still getting pushed back?
It's chilling, honestly, because he can be held in pre-trial detention almost indefinitely. I mean, effectively, what the Russians are saying is we're investigating this. If he's not on trial, he's in pre-trial detention, and these hearings that we're seeing are about basically whether or not he could be released while he waits for some kind of process.
Yeah.
Now, of course, one of the questions, and I don't know the answer to this, might be whether there needs to be some kind of a hearing before there is any kind of a swap. But nothing is guaranteed. I mean, just think about what President Putin said just after his election. He claimed, OK, we may not want to believe it, he claimed that he had agreed that Alexei Navalny be released from prison. And then days later, Alexei Navalny died. What does that tell us about the way the Russian state works at this stage? That President Putin himself claims he wanted him released, and yet he didn't survive.
It doesn't sound good, frankly. Keir Simmons, Joel Rubin, thank you, gentlemen, very much.
Hey, everyone. MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.